Okay, thank you very much. It's nice to see Scotland as part of the international section. I'm not quite sure what that says. Um, and just to put my background in context as I go into this, I'm very much not a Roman archaeologist. I really do archaeology of the Middle East professionally. And perhaps tragically, it turns out what I do in my spare time is more archaeology. So, in many respects, I'm one of the volunteers producing the archaeology around Newstead, and have learned a huge amount, a little bit occasionally, about Roman archaeology as well. So, there's Trimontium, sitting in the south of Scotland on one of the main communication routes, the main road going up on the eastern side of the south of Scotland, um, situated between the two walls. And for a considerable period, it was essentially within a frontier zone. The site itself is now barely discernible, mainly visible as crop marks near the Eildon Hills, just outside Melrose, next to the village of Newstead. And I'm going to use the place names of modern village of Newstead and the ancient name of the fort, Trimontium, pretty much interchangeably. Um, Newstead itself, Trimontium itself, is on a particularly key local communication point. It's next to the three hills of the Eildon Hills that you saw in the previous slide, so it's a very visible landmark. At times, it seems to have been surrounded by a local population where there was surprisingly little immediately obvious Roman impact. And on the map on the right, all these little blue dots are local hill forts, and we're very much in the heartland of hill fort country here. And the fort itself was certainly occupied and abandoned on multiple occasions. I think the sequence that I've put down here, which is kind of the most conventional one, possibly oversimplifies it. And I think there's certainly a lot of evidence from temporary marching camps that there was a lot of much more transitory Roman activity on and around the site at Newstead as well. It's been excavated 3 times. There was particularly major fieldwork just before the First World War when it was carried out by James Carroll. Richmond very briefly put some trenches on the site, and then there was another decade of activity from the late 1980s to the late 1990s, all of which provide a backdrop where we might expect to know quite a lot about the Roman fort, but a lot of what we think we know is perhaps based on quite biased and not always systematically retrieved evidence. And that's a background to the fieldwork we've been doing over the last 2 or 3 years, which has been an integrated program of fieldwalking and particularly metal detecting survey that's been carried out with support of Historic Environment Scotland, but it's essentially been driven by a large group of very dedicated volunteers in all sorts of roles within this. And as I say, although I've been coordinating it in this context, I would see myself as a volunteer who just happens to have a few relevant transferable skills that can be used within an archaeological project. And it's fair to say it's not only been a case of simply discovering Roman material. A lot of that Roman material is actually material that Carroll in his original excavations didn't retrieve, wasn't recognized by his workmen, and simply ended up in his backfill. It's been, rather than a focused fieldwork project that's run for a period of weeks across the summer or something like that, it's essentially been a year-round community project with fieldwork taking place at weekends, finds processing sessions taking place during the week. And this is a very easy forum to allude to the benefits that come out of these sorts of volunteer projects. It has been very much about creating communities around the practice of archaeology and discovering new connections, just as much as it's been about discovering the past in itself. And one of the things that I've found particularly satisfying is the extent to which we've been able to bring metal detectorists themselves within an archaeological project and use it as a formal survey method. That I think even now, detectorists are often the people who first discover things. They pass things over to archaeologists, but then the archaeologists take over and run the subsequent project. So instead, we've had an approach that integrates them within it. It has involved persuading them to work in tram lines within 20 by 20 meter squares, but it's actually turned out to be an extremely productive form of survey technique that's forcing me to think through the ways in which we can make use of that within landscape archaeology. And I'll allude to that a little bit as we go on. It's also been a very nice exercise in developing some of the ways that we can use minimally invasive approaches to tease more information out about what would have been termed one of the best studied Roman sites in Scotland. And one of the motives, I'm not really going to say much else about, is it's a site that had been quite badly hit by illegal metal detecting over the years. So part of the plan was also to remove that temptation by taking a lot of the more easily retrieved material out of the plough soil of the site and make it less rewarding. So if we look at the landscape of the fort itself, you've got the village of Newstead on the left-hand side there, and the plan of the fort, at least the plan according to Carroll, just before the First World War, with sizable annexes to the west and south, and something a little bit more ephemeral on the eastern side as well. If we zoom in on it a little bit on the area of the fort, that's where we've been really focusing the survey and the metal detecting. And over a period of a bit over a year, we produced over 4,500 objects from that area. It's really been a phenomenal amount of material to clean, to stabilize, to conserve, and we're still in the process of working through and recording that. Clearly, the large majority of that material isn't actually Roman. We've got all the normal bits of plough, bits of fencing, all sorts of things there as well. But we've also got an unexpectedly rich series of artifacts that postdate the Roman period. And in some ways, that's one of the lessons of doing this sort of work, that you don't necessarily get to pick and choose what you're interested in. What you encounter through systematic metal detecting is really a deep history of utilization of that particular landscape. So if you let me deviate a little bit from the theme of this meeting and not talk about Roman finds at all, just one example of the sort of use of landscape that's hinting at stories that we don't quite understand. There's this intriguing coin with Arabic writing on it. That's an example of the coin in much better condition. That's not the coin itself conserved. That's, I think, stolen off eBay possibly. That it's a coin from Somalia Italiana. Turns out to be minted round about the First World War, and presumably is in some now unreconstructible way giving us a trace of the British Empire, campaigns in East Africa and things like that round about the First World War. But even this sort of post-Roman material has got intersections where it helps us to understand the Roman site as well. And I want to continue deviating a little bit into that. And I will get to Roman finds before long, I promise, and spend a bit of time diving into one or two of the stories that come out of them as well. But one of the things I was interested when we started doing the work at Trimontium is there was obviously a series of events in the fields, 1905 to 1910, when there were a large number of workmen when Carr was excavating the site. Is there any tangible remains of the excavation of Roman archaeology, never mind evidence from Roman archaeology itself? And from the field walking, I think the answer is cautiously positive about that. That we know there are post-medieval ceramics lying around in the field. most of them 19th, early 20th century rubbish that was dumped from the village of Newstead. It's got a well-defined concentration down in the western corner of the field. But if you look at things like pipe fragments, they're much more extensively documented, and I strongly suspect that this may correlate with James Carroll's workmen spending substantial amounts of time in the field and smoking. One of the things I was quite interested in is, would other artifacts also give us evidence of the excavation of Roman Newstead of Trimontium? And I did wonder whether looking at the substantial number of buttons that date from the 18th and 19th centuries might provide an indication. The workmen might have been wearing old clothes and they'd get preferentially discarded in the fields. And I'm partly showing this just because I absolutely love this next distribution map, because it turns out that hypothesis is completely wrong. That all the stars are the distribution of 18th and 19th century buttons, and where they're particularly absent is this whole swathe in the middle, which is interesting because we don't really know where Carroll excavated, where his evidence came from, and I'm almost certain the reason we don't get as many buttons in the middle of the site is because they were lying around on the surface of the site, knocking around in the topsoil. Carroll came along, dug deep trenches in the site, and dragged buttons down from the surface when he backfilled the site, leaving a reduced number lying around on the surface. And that's just a wonderful example of how surface remains can correlate to quite complex activities that have taken place in the past. But enough of that. This is meant to be the Roman finds group, so I'll show some Roman finds. There's a very rich body of material that's come up. This is a very small sample of some of the more exciting objects that have come from the fort of Trimontium through metal detecting. Whole range of very nice enamel brooches. The center there, you've got a nice whirl brooch. There's another equally nice one that came up during the detecting program. Quite a range of decorative objects. Things like the cast lead model of an insect, I think is very similar to one that was shown in one of the earlier talks. And certainly there were phallic pendants that were shown earlier on. We've got a pendant that's not just one phallus, but is a double phallus, so we're scoring well on that ground. Large numbers of new coins. Silver is very well preserved in the topsoil of the site. Copper alloy coins tend to be very, very poorly preserved, and it's clear the plough zone is quite a hostile environment for preserving coins like that. But I want to, rather than just giving a general overview of here's a nice object, here's another nice object, here's a further nice object, I thought I'd do a bit more of a deep dive into a selected group of the more military artifacts that have come from the site, partly because they represent a category of object that's almost entirely lacking in Carroll's original publications of the site and from subsequent work at the site, but also where we've done a bit more analysis on it, there are some interesting possibilities that are starting to arise out of that. So I want to look at three loosely related categories of object that have been coming up. All of them individually are known from elsewhere within Britain and within Europe. It's not that these are spectacularly new, but they are within the context of Newstead. So you've got the category of tie rings, where we've now got half a dozen or so of these. They're well known, used for placing hoops on the outside of segmented armour that you could attach other things to. You could use for ties as part of assembling and securing the armour. None of them were found in Carroll's excavations, and that may be because although he found very well preserved armour, it was all found in deep pits at the site. And I wonder if these are coming through a more everyday loss of small objects, whereas retrieval strategies were simply not good enough to retrieve these very small items. When I show these, there are a couple on the right-hand side that I've put in a red box that seem a bit cruder than other ones, and I'll come back to those in a minute or two. Second category of object are helmet rivets. These seem to be characteristically from Niederbiber helmets, infantry type of helmet, that the conventional date for the use is between about 160 and 230 AD, which is right at the end of the possible occupation of Newstead. It's usually assumed that it was abandoned by about 180 AD. We've got a whole variety of candidates of these in the row of illustrations at the bottom. I think the ones on the left and the centre, I'm reasonably happy probably do come from Niederbiber helmets, but there are others that are more elaborate that might be filials, might be used as rivets in other sorts of contexts, although I know there's some indication that they could be used on helmets as well. That's interesting. They're almost unknown from Newstead, and they're almost unknown from Roman Scotland. They're well attested further south in Britain, so there are lots of examples in England, lots of examples in Wales, but the only other examples that I'm aware of that have been found in Scotland were found at Cramond, where fairly late occupation running into the early 3rd century has been known for a long time. So it perhaps suggests that there's something interesting that's going on quite a late stage at Newstead. And this is the example where Carroll actually did find one of these helmet rivets. And I think he only found it because it was attached to the helmet visor. So it was part of a big chunk of metalwork. But we only realized that there was a helmet rivet of that sort once we'd actually found these examples through metal detecting. And a final category of object that I want to link together here are these turning pins, which seem to have been characteristically used to connect the panels of a breastplate. And the example on the left-hand side did not come from Newstead. We've only found the tiny little turning rings. Again, they probably date at the very end of the occupation of the site. We've found a couple of very good examples and a very crude example of what appears to be the same thing on the right-hand side there. Now it gets more interesting when you turn to another of my quite useful transferable skills is start looking at the metal composition that's involved here. And this is based on portable XRF analysis, which comes with a little bit of a health warning because it gives you a good reading of the surface of the object, and there are issues around corrosion and enhancement of different elements at the surface. But nonetheless, they're all bronze. So they're not brass, which was probably being used for quite a lot of the armor pieces. They're all bronze, but they're notably very high in tin and very high in lead. And I think because that's going to be a set of deliberate choices, that's probably related to choices around the properties of the metal. So on the one hand, it would weaken the metal. But when you've got things that are joining other bits of armor together, there may be advantages to that. It may make them more malleable, so they bend rather than breaking. So you reduce the brittleness of the joining piece. It may be that the lead in it actually promotes smoother movement, that it almost acts as a lubricant, which again would be advantageous for little bits of metal that are joining armor together. Another thing, when you look at that cluster of compositions, and these triangular graphs are horrible to read, but if you look at that cluster of compositions, you can see 4 that are quite marginal in terms of composition. If you look at those artifacts, those are the ones that seem rather crude examples compared to the mainstream examples that we've retrieved. And I would suspect that this is local replacement of broken objects using an alloy that approximates the ideal one, but without the ability to control it in detail. So that's just a very quick insight into some of the things that have been going on from fieldwork in Newstead. A lot of the material is very rich because it's essentially coming from Karl's backfill. This is all the stuff that wasn't being picked up by his early 20th century retrieval techniques. And it allows us to use quite a lot of that material to start to fill in some of the gaps in the material assemblage that Karl's excavations produced. And to some extent, that's not atypical of quite a lot of the material from Roman Scotland. A lot of it comes from older sites where there was less controlled retrieval. So actually getting a large sample of small metal objects is quite valuable in itself. But I think it's also worth linking it back to the fact that I'm a little bit reluctant just to look at the Roman period in isolation. It's part of a much longer landscape history in those fields, some of which was actually linked to the survival of the Roman remains. There are records from the 18th century of stones being taken there, probably from walls that were still visible. And some of it, as I say, does give insights into the nature of archaeology at Roman sites in the early 20th century in Scotland as well. So I'd say thank you very much for listening. Thank you hugely to the volunteer community that has made this possible. Anyone who's interested in getting involved in this field work, there are contact details at the bottom. But thank you very much indeed.